Welcome to my scientifically informed insider look at mental health topics. If you find this video to be interesting or helpful, please like it and subscribe to my channel. Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question asks, is Tony Robbins a fraud? I've also received a number of other questions about Tony Robbins. Is Tony Robbins guilty of these different allegations that have been placed against him recently? And really a number of other comments about his success and how he got there and his role in mental health. Should he have a role? Really just a lot of questions. Tony Robbins is a popular figure, and of course with these recent allegations he's been a more popular figure recently than probably ever. Now I'm going to offer my opinions on the allegations and his mental health advice. I'm kind of restricting this video to those two elements. Another important point here, of course, is Tony Robbins is a real person. So I'm just looking at the available evidence and just really speculating based on what could be happening in a situation like this, not making any type of diagnosis. Now, Tony Robbins is a very popular life coach. He was born in 1960. So at the time of making this video, he's 59 years old, and his net worth is about $482 million. As far as I know, he doesn't have an education that extends beyond high school, and he has no mental health credentials, like he's not a licensed counselor or a licensed social worker or something like that. He has a lot of books, and he does a lot of really huge multi-day seminars. Again, he's very popular. These seminars are very flashy. They have a lot of loud music. Tony Robbins is very energetic and active, and he's yelling at the crowd, getting them all worked up. Many have described the experience as life-changing, and they describe it as an emotional experience. So I mentioned he claims to be a life coach. What is a life coach? Well, a life coach is somebody that helps others to meet their goals, gain confidence, become motivated, find their purpose and meaning in life, or kind of a purpose for their business or something like that. Life coaches don't require any type of qualifications or education, and they're not mental health professionals. And sometimes what happens, and I'll talk about this in this video, is they kind of wander over into the mental health area. Now, we do see that Tony Robbins has been very financially successful, and there's a lot of controversy surrounding him, but really there's always been a lot of controversy surrounding him. We find a lot of people who support him very vigorously. They really like him, and we find a large group of people that don't really like him. I suppose this is true of anybody who's famous, though, so that shouldn't be surprising. I've noticed in general that life coaches do tend to like Tony Robbins, and mental health professionals and people who are more oriented towards science tend not to like him. That doesn't mean that that covers everybody and explains everybody's behavior. It's just what I've noticed. Now, recently I've actually talked to a few life coaches and to a few mental health professionals about Tony Robbins, really just preparing for this video. And one interesting exchange with a mental health professional I'll mention here. I was talking to I think it was a social worker, and she was saying that she had, strong opinions about Tony Robbins. And I mentioned I was going to make this video, and I had some positive and negative things to say about Tony Robbins, especially as he relates to mental health. And she told me that I was an irresponsible loser for saying anything positive about Tony Robbins. And I replied to that by saying, there's no evidence I've ever been irresponsible. She didn't quite get the humor there. And I've noticed this, with a few people I've talked to about Tony Robbins. They come at you kind of strongly and call you names, and then you kind of respond in a funny way or whatever, and they're just not having it because they're so emotional about Tony Robbins, right? So he brings out, for better or worse, kind of strong emotional reactions in people, and it's difficult to diffuse. So I understand that this video can have that same impact, and I'm really working here to stay balanced. And I think that whether you really like Tony Robbins or you don't, if you watch this whole video, you'll find that I make a sincere and evidence-based effort to be fair. Fair being a unique point in time, right? There's no such thing as more than fair or very fair. Fair is an infinite, tiny point on a continuum, right? So it's hard to achieve, but I think that at least some will find that I did my best to do that. So I'm going to start here with the allegations. Now, these allegations were put forth by BuzzFeed News. So right away, I have some difficulty with them, and I'll mention that. But let's first take a look at these allegations in terms of what makes Tony Robbins look guilty, and then I'll take a look at what makes him look innocent, and I will cover both sides of this. So on the guilty side, we see allegations of harassment from multiple people. I lost count when going through the BuzzFeed articles, but I'll put the links to those articles in the description of this video. But we see, again, multiple incidents, and some go back all the way to the 80s. And this is, hard to dismiss, right? There's a lot of allegations, and the people are not connected to one another, so this doesn't look good. And also, I think, in part, the reply we see, like from Tony Robbins' attorneys, I find kind of interesting. For example, they said that one of these allegations had to do with Tony Robbins appearing naked in front of staff. They said that Tony Robbins was never intentionally naked, which makes me wonder, what other kind of naked is there? Accidentally being naked? So they're being careful in their wording, right? He also apologized in a video that I just watched last night, where he said that he was sorry for any offense that his actions caused. So he didn't take responsibility specifically to the allegations. He maintains that he's not guilty, but he still apologized. Now, this just could be him being nice, but I think it points more towards guilt than innocence. But I don't take it as kind of a major piece of evidence. Now, the other problem here in terms of what makes him look guilty is the recording. And this is, of course, available on YouTube and probably other places as well, where he's talking to a woman who says she was emotionally and physically abused. And he essentially says, I'm not going to quote him directly, but he essentially says, what is emotional abuse? He kind of calls into question that it exists at all. And he also suggests that physical abuse can be caused by behavior perpetrated by the person who is the victim, right? So not very empathetic to physical abuse victims, although he does kind of issue a disclaimer in there saying he doesn't support physical abuse. Now, he also indicates that he knows the woman is lying by her body, that's what he says, and by her words and context. Now, when I get to the other side, we'll talk about her reaction, but just in terms of what makes him look guilty, these are the components that I think make him look that way. We also see that allegedly he's made legal threats against people who talk to BuzzFeed. That doesn't look good either. So what makes him look innocent in all this? Well, there's actually quite a bit that points more toward innocence. We see that he maintains that they are lying, so that's his statement. We see this type of mathematical reason, where essentially he said in this video that he's interacted with a lot of people, thousands and thousands of people, and yet there's only a few allegations. And this spans over 30 years, or more than 30 years. So, okay, that's not a bad argument to look at the math. I mean, he's interacted with so many people. If he was really doing these things, wouldn't more come forward? We also see there's no physical evidence, there's no video. There are a number of people testifying to his good character. Then kind of the strongest point, I think, that points toward his innocence, which is really about this idea of BuzzFeed reporting this. Is BuzzFeed really a news organization? Not really, right? I mean, I don't really trust what BuzzFeed says, so this kind of points toward innocence. Potentially, they kind of tampered with witness statements, it sounds like. They distorted witness statements. Many have said the recording was taken out of context, right? This is the audio recording. So to that I would say, well, was it an act? Was he auditioning for a play? What constitutes context, right? How far back from something do we need to be before we say it's in context? But either way, there's this idea here that the recording is out of context. And the woman in the recording, her name is Campos, she appears to agree with Tony Robbins and even made her own video defending him. So when weighing all the allegations, the truth is that I don't know. There are a lot of accusers here just to dismiss the whole story, but Tony made some good points. The mathematical reasoning and the age of some of the alleged incidents, right, going back more than 30 years. Wealthy people are targets for this type of behavior, these allegations. And right now, of course, nothing has been proven in a court of law. These are simply allegations. So now moving on to the mental health advice portion. And again, this is where I'm really more critical. I will list general positives, but my negatives will really mostly be restricted to mental health advice giving on the part of Tony Robbins. So taking a look at some of the positives. Well, Tony is charismatic, optimistic. He has a positive attitude, probably more positive than almost anybody I've ever seen. He has a seemingly endless number of people that like him. He has a lot of followers. He attempts to provide advice across a number of areas, some of which he's probably quite familiar with. They're related to the field of life coaching, like leadership, business, financial advice, being a high performer, being more productive, physical fitness and health advice, training other people to be life coaches like him. All this seems quite legitimate in the context of life coaching, and as far as I can tell, he does it fairly well. So I really see a number of positives in the areas where he doesn't get involved with mental health. So now moving over to the negatives. Tony gets into some other areas that really wander into the realm of counseling and mental health. To some extent, like emotional intelligence, romantic relationships, but also in other areas that are more closely tied to mental health, like coping with abuse, including emotional and physical abuse. And we even see times where he's dealing with more severe issues, potentially more severe, like harming oneself, depression, anxiety, or addiction, right? So, of course, emotional and physical abuse can be quite severe too, but either way, we see a lot of different mental health issues that he touches on. So there is this idea that he crosses the line between life coaching, again, and mental health counseling. And this is really what's most worrisome to me in terms of Tony Robbins. We also see this concern that his methods are not empirically supported. Some of the techniques he uses include embracing others or otherwise touching strangers, self-disclosing to strangers, believing that feelings lead to better decisions than thinking. So a few problems. We see kind of really simplistic solutions to what I would say are fairly complex mental health problems, right? Some examples would be, he says, take the weight off your shoulders when somebody expresses a concern about anxiety or depression. He says, focus on your authentic desires. Okay. Connect with your confidence. Again, really not sure what that means, but all right. And then unlock your inner power. And I really don't know what that means. Now, we also see perplexing statements and ideology. For example, he says there's no such thing as a resistant client, but rather clients who are just trying to preserve their mixed up values and belief structures. Well, isn't this kind of like saying there's no such thing as green? There's just a mixture of blue and yellow? So he's just really renaming resistance by using its components. So if you rename something, it doesn't exist. Not really sure what he's doing there. He also says that everyone has multiple personalities, and all they need to do is put a different part in charge. Does he really mean multiple personalities, like in terms of personality theory? Or does he just mean multiple moods? So I'm really not sure what he's doing there with the personality talk. I also read an interview where Tony claims that he became a practical psychologist at age 7 or 8. He became an expert in recognizing his mother's triggers. Now, when he says practical psychologist, I don't know if he means that or if he really meant he practically became a psychologist, but either way, I think I see his point. And this is very common among life coaches. They believe they're experts because they had a first-hand experience, and they overgeneralize this to everybody else. Now, everyone is an expert in their own experience. That's legitimate. But the idea that everyone's interpretation and experience of abuse or stress or mental health symptoms is the same is just not true. One is not an expert in the sense that they can tell everybody what to do just because they had an experience of their own. So we see other examples of him wandering into the area of mental health as well. He claims he's cured suicidal ideation. We see an example where he pressures an abuse survivor to tell her story in front of this huge audience, and then asks her to be vulnerable with these 3 strangers from the audience who he calls uncles. I don't know what was going on there. And he also pressured a woman to break up with her boyfriend on her cell phone in front of a huge audience. Now, as I understand it, she actually reunited with that boyfriend later on. But still, I think he's really wandering into areas of mental health disorders potentially here, right? It's the difference between feeling good now and feeling good in the long term. So maybe those people felt better because they interacted with Tony Robbins in front of this large audience, but were those gains durable? Now, I've been critical of life coaches in the past, especially those who kind of talk about mental health a lot. And really, I have good reasons for this. One is the idea that some life coaches really commit to neurolinguistic programming, to this theory. And Tony Robbins is one of these life coaches who does this. Neurolinguistic programming is also called NLP. And we know that Tony Robbins met one of the individuals who developed NLP, named John Grinder. When Tony was 23, he met John Grinder. and it had a fairly significant impact on him. Now, one of the areas we really see this come out is in the idea that somebody can detect lies, and we see that Tony claims to be able to do this. I have a number of other criticisms specifically about NLP, which I covered in a video a while ago, so I won't go through all that detail. But that's one area that I'm worried about. When we look at Tony Robbins, we see that he really is a very successful life coach, much more successful than we would normally see with a life coach. But other than that, other than his wealth and fame and all that, I really don't see what makes him special compared to other life coaches. I mean, he has more charisma and energy and all that, and again, success, but in terms of his theory, in terms of his principles, I don't really see him as that distinct. It's really the same old story. Experts don't know anything because they became experts through years of education and years of experience, and somehow that could never make anybody more productive or knowledgeable in their field. Experts rely on science instead of feelings, and of course this is supposed to be a bad thing. A common defense I hear for Tony Robbins is that he is a creative genius, just like many famous theorists and scientists, except those theorists and scientists conducted studies and allowed their methods to be studied, but Tony Robbins is somehow just as good because he refused to accept the validity of the scientific method. I actually think that particular defense more or less makes my case. But there are other defenses that I've seen made on behalf of Tony Robbins. For example, he's rich and successful, and critics are simply jealous. I think this is a fair point. That's going to happen some of the time. We see another example, mental health professionals are just in it for the money. Well, okay, if that's true, is Tony Robbins not in it for the money? And how do we know how to tell them apart? That one really doesn't make as much sense. We also see he hangs out with famous people. Do famous people always have good judgment? The same thing for the argument, he works for big companies. Do big companies have good judgment? Do companies even have judgment at all? It's still individuals who make decisions. We also see this argument that he's competent because he cares about people. Well, I agree caring is important, but I would say that being caring is necessary but not sufficient for being competent. So being a caring person is important, but competence is another level. So with all these points in mind, why do so many people like him? Well, again, I'm only really critical of the mental health aspects. So probably a lot of people like him because he's actually helped thousands of people. I believe this is true. A lot of people have come forward and said that Tony Robbins changed their lives. Fair enough. What happens some of the time, though, is that we know that people are more likely to defend bad decisions as opposed to good decisions. And with his seminars costing $5,000 to $8,000, it could be that some people don't want to admit that they paid all that money and didn't get much value. Now, I don't think that explains the majority of people, but it might explain some of the people that are really, kind of on board with Tony Robbins, that really, really like him to an enthusiastic degree that seems abnormally high. All right, so he probably helped a lot of people, and some people probably don't want to admit they spent money without getting value. So to sum it up, I like a lot of the stuff Tony Robbins does when he stays away from mental health. Again, the charisma, the positive attitude, the energy. I think he's really good in a lot of ways. I wish he had a mechanism to refer people with mental health disorders to professionals, rather than try to treat them in a few minutes in front of thousands of people, or even in an hour in a group, whatever. And I think that's what happened with that recording. I think that was in a smaller group. But either way, that's what I would really ask, is just some sort of mechanism to protect people who have mental health disorders. I don't think Tony Robbins is evil or bad or a negative force in the world or anything like that. I just look at mental health disorders as really requiring specialized attention from experts. Mental disorders aren't something that just go away on their own. I mean, sometimes they do, but that's not how we conceptualize them. Depression, for example, is a serious mental disorder that for some people can end with them ending their lives. It's not something we can just play around with and try to fix with a book or in a few minutes in a seminar. We have to take these things seriously. Depression isn't something that people can just wish away through positive thinking. I wish it was that easy. It's a serious illness that has a chronic course. It's episodic and chronic. And it's actually well studied, and science tells us a lot of interesting information that's helpful in terms of treatment. Science also tells us that the life coaching principles don't help with major depressive disorder. So again, I'm just looking for a line to be drawn between life coaching and mental health treatment, right? So Tony Robbins, I'm sure in many ways is a nice person. Again, I don't know about the allegations. I discussed those earlier in the video. I just don't know. We need more information on that. But we do need to understand the role of life coaching as opposed to the role of mental health professionals. So I hope that both those who really like Tony Robbins and those that don't looked at this video and kind of saw the balance and the fairness that I tried to achieve. Now, I know whenever I talk about anything, especially a controversial figure like Tony Robbins, there will be people who agree and disagree with me. Please put those opinions in the comments section. I think in this case they're almost sure to generate an interesting dialogue. As always, I hope you found this critique of Tony Robbins and his mental health advice to be interesting. Thanks for watching.